Welcome everyone. We're going to begin the second half of the course this week. And in this online lecture, we're going to look at the origins of the Mexican-American War. And over the next 2 weeks, we'll be reading about the Mexican-American War and A Glorious Defeat. So I'm going to go over some of the main points of this period in this online lecture. And in the online discussions over the next 2 weeks, we'll go over some of the details. We'll go into more depth about some of the general points that I'm going to be making here. And let me just begin with some of the general characteristics of this period. And as you can see on the outline, which you should have in front of you, political instability was a main characteristic of this period. But before I go into some of the politics of this period, let's look at 1A, the First Mexican Empire. And it lasted from 1821 to 1823, and this is where Agustín de Iturbide was the emperor of Mexico during these years. It wasn't a republic yet, and the map you see here is the First Mexican Empire, and you can see it was enormous. It extended all the way up into California, into Texas. And after independence, one of the things that contributed to political instability was that the economy really suffered during these years, and not just the 1820s, but all throughout the mid-19th century, the economy really suffered. And the main reason for that is that the mining economy, which had been the lifeblood of the colonial economy, it came to a standstill during the Wars of Independence. The mines became dangerous to be around and they were abandoned. And when mines are abandoned, when it rains, that means the mines flood. And there was not enough capital, not enough money to invest into getting the mines back into operation during these years. And keep in mind, this is the time when the United States and Europe were industrializing, but Mexico's economy suffers during these years. And it wouldn't be really until the 1860s that Mexico's economy, and particularly the mining economy, was revived. And also agricultural production dropped during these years. And another reason for the political instability was that from the beginning, these early post-independence governments, they were running up debts. Public revenues could not meet public expenditures. And this forced Mexican governments in the 1820s and 30s to start taking out foreign loans. And these loans were taken out at high interest rates. So these governments could never balance their budgets. And the First Mexican Empire, it only lasts 2 years, as you can see here on the outline, from 1821 to 1823. In 1823, Agustín de Iturbide, he was overthrown. He had kind of behaved like a dictator, and he was very authoritarian, and he opposed, he used a lot of force just to oppose his opposition politicians. And in 1823, he was overthrown by Santa Anna. And I want to talk about Santa Anna a little bit here, and we're going to read a lot about him in the book this week. So we'll go into more detail about him. And I also want to discuss this first key term, caudillo. Caudillos were military/political leaders during this period, and they dominated politics for several decades after Mexico gained independence in the 1820s. And we're going to talk about Santa Anna here, and we'll be reading about him. And he was the most famous of the caudillos in 19th century Mexico. But there were many more than just him. And many of these caudillos, they had served in the patriot cause during the Wars of Independence. And they were rewarded afterwards with land. So often the caudillos were landowners. They were usually very charismatic, their personalities, so they had a large personal following, and they enjoyed access to resources as well, so they would reward their followers with patronage and resources. And caudillos were very authoritarian. They came to power through force, not through elections. And they generally stood above the law and government structures. Caudillos were repeatedly coming to power during these years and leading these revolutions because the governments, the president, they were very weak during these years. And by the way, after Iturbide was overthrown in 1823, that was when a republic was established. And Santa Anna was one of the main politicians in the 1820s and the 1830s. And these weak governments that couldn't meet their budgets, that made them vulnerable to these caudillos that would lead revolutions and overthrow them. So it was like this vicious cycle. Weak governments couldn't maintain power, but these strong caudillos would be able to overthrow these weak governments. And Santa Anna, he had served in the Patriot cause during the Wars of Independence, and he was originally from Veracruz. And as I said, we'll be going into much more detail about him in the book, and I have some questions set up about him. So what I really want to discuss here is this part of the lecture that is 1B, liberals and conservatives. And I want to talk about their ideologies here, because these were the two factions that dominated politics during these years. And Santa Anna, he at first was a liberal, but he is going to become more conservative over time. And so by the 1830s, he actually becomes a conservative and sheds his liberal party identity. Let's begin here with liberalism. And we already discussed liberalism quite a bit in the late colonial period and how it influenced the Creoles to have this new identity during the late colonial period that distinguished themselves from the Spaniards. But let's go into more depth about liberals and conservatives. And again, you're going to read about this in the book, and I have some questions about it in the online discussion. But in general, liberals were very forward-looking, and they were obsessed with progress. Liberals emphasized things like equality before the law, government of the people, and really important to the liberal ideology in post-independent Mexico was that liberals believed in the separation of church and state. Catholicism throughout the 1820s and 30s remained the official religion of the government, and this issue of separation of church and state is something we're going to talk about in the next week as well, when we talk about the liberal reform period of the 1860s and Benito Juarez. And liberals also believed that a public education system should be set up. They believed in public schooling. If you remember from the colonial period, it was the church that controlled all education, but the liberals are calling for a public education to be set up. And liberals also believed in free trade, and they really wanted to model the Mexican government and country after their northern neighbor, the United States. And in particular, they looked to France and Britain as their main cultural influences. And conservatives, and one more thing about liberals. Liberals also believed in states' rights. They were what we call federalists. They believed in federalism, that power should reside in the states. And conservatives, on the other hand, they believed in centralism, and they believed in a very strong central government, that Mexico City should have all the power, and it should dominate the different states and the different regions throughout the country. Some conservatives also believed that Mexico should be a monarchy after independence, so it shouldn't have a president, and instead it should have a king at the head of government. And the belief was that you have this vast territory, that's these different ethnicities and different regional identities, and it would take a strong central government and a king at the head of it to be able to unite all these diverse people, similar to the colonial period. And that was a main characteristic of the conservatives, was that they believed that society should not change much from the colonial period, that the way that society had been organized and the hierarchy should remain the same. And conservatives also believed, and this was very important to them, that Catholicism should remain the official religion of the state. And so conservatives look back to the colonial period, and they also look to Spain as their main cultural influence. And conservatives certainly did not see any need for public education. They believed that the church should remain the main educator in post-independent Mexico. So the conservatives emphasized tradition and the role of the church in Mexican society. Let's now look at the Texas Revolution of 1836, and some of you may be well familiar with this, given the importance that it is to Texas history. And after independence in the 1820s and 30s, you had this vast frontier in northern Mexico stretching from Texas to California. And in that entire territory, there were only about 100,000 Mexicans. So you have this vast territory, but really few people living there. And Mexico in the 1820s actually sought to promote immigration to that region, but it was quite difficult to get many Mexicans to move northwards because life on the frontier was very difficult. Particularly Indian raids and Indian attacks made life difficult. And also just the food supply was not very abundant on the northern frontier. And one group that did start to migrate into Texas in the 1820s and early 1830s were Anglo-Protestant Americans. White Americans started to pour into Texas in the 1820s and 30s. And specifically, it was the expansion of the cotton economy, which had been booming in the United States in the early 19th century. It starts to spread into Texas. So a lot of cotton farms were being set up in Texas by these white farmers in the 1820s and 30s. As I mentioned, at first they were welcome, and you'll read about Stephen F. Austin, and they were given thousands of lands to settle in Texas as long as they would become Catholic and swear allegiance to the Mexican government. And the number of Americans coming into Texas actually the Americans started to outnumber Mexicans in Texas. And so by 1835, there were about 30,000 American colonists in Texas. And they brought with them 5,000 slaves. And the number of Mexicans was many fewer. Only about 3,000 to 4,000 Mexicans lived in Texas during the 1820s and 30s. So already, by 1835 and 1836, when the Texas Revolution begins, there were many, many more Americans in the region. And again, most of them were setting up cotton farms. And as I mentioned, they brought slaves with them. And at first, the Mexican government in Santa Ana welcomed this immigration. But as slavery started to expand in Texas, Mexico became uncomfortable with the Americanization of Texas, right? They started to fear, we might lose Texas if we don't populate it with more Mexicans. And in 1829, in fact, that's when slavery was abolished in Mexico, and it was aimed specifically at Texas because that's where where slavery was growing during these years. And as you can imagine, this upset many of the American colonists in Texas. And there were other complaints that the American colonists had. For example, Texas was actually part of Coahuila during these years. And if you wanted to do any kind of official business, you had to go to the state capital, which was in Saltillo, which is much further, several hundred miles south from Texas. And a lot of the American colonists also did not like the constant revolutions that were occurring in Mexico City. This just made it difficult to get any kind of official business done. And particularly, though, it was the what's referred to as the 1835 centralizing reforms. And this is also called the Seven Laws. That's the last key term here on the outline. And you'll read about this as well. But in 1835, Santa Anna comes to power once again, and he becomes a dictator. And he completely reforms the government. And by this time, he had become more conservative. And so he believed in a strong central government during this period. Back in the 1820s, he had been a liberal that believed in states' rights. And of course, Texans, being far away from Mexico City, was a very... people believed in federalism there. They believed in states' rights. They wanted more autonomy. They didn't want to be ruled by Mexico City and all their affairs. But in 1835, these 7 laws, and you don't need to memorize every law. I'm just going to summarize some of the main ones here, and we'll discuss them online. The 7 laws centralized power in Mexico City. That's why they're called, sometimes referred to as the centralizing reforms. And states were turned into departments of the federal government. So states lost a lot of autonomy and a lot of their rights. And in fact, the governors were no longer elected by the people, but instead governors were now appointed by the president in Mexico City. And also state militias were abolished. So this, of course, hurt the state's abilities to defend themselves during these years. And these 7 laws, centralizing reforms, really is what upset many of the American colonists in Texas. And shortly afterwards, they would revolt against Mexican rule. And there's a whole chapter we're going to read about this in the book, A Glorious Defeat. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but they revolt in 1836, and you can see kind of what transpired here on the map. They revolt in February of 1836. Santa Anna sends an army northwards to reconquer Texas and to squash the rebellion. And of course, one of the first conflicts occurred in San Antonio at the Siege of the Alamo. And as you're probably familiar with the story, the Mexican army surrounded the rebels at the Alamo, and there was a great massacre that occurred afterwards of the rebels. And remember the Alamo, of course, became the slogan for the rebels. And shortly afterwards, there was another massacre that the Mexican army carried out at Goliad. And we're talking about several hundred people were killed, both at the Alamo and at Goliad. And there afterwards, the Mexican army started to pursue the rebels all the way to around the present-day Houston. And you see on April 21st was where the Battle of San Jacinto occurred. And you can go visit, actually, the battle, and there's a museum there today, right? It's maybe about 20, 25 minutes from downtown Houston. I certainly recommend you go visit it, a good historical spot. But there is where the rebels, led by Sam Houston, defeated Santa Anna. And Santa Anna was actually captured, and that was where he relinquished Texas. And of course, Mexico loses Texas as a result of the Battle of San Jacinto. And you all know that Texas was an independent country for about the next 9 years. And the Lone Star Republic, as it's known. And we'll read more about the Texas Revolution, but just know that the Texas Revolution was crucial to the origins of the Mexican-American War, because Mexico was really never going to recognize Texas's independence. And Santa Anna, from the beginning, had plans to reconquer Texas. All right, now let's briefly look at the Mexican-American War itself. It was fought from 1846 to 1848, but here I've just called it, and sometimes just referred to simply as the War of 1847, because that's when the majority of the war was fought. And looking at the outline here, the second part, I want to discuss the boundary dispute that was the immediate cause of the war. So there had been tensions that were riding high between the United States and Mexico and over the issue of Texas, because Texas, as soon as it became this Lone Star Republic in 1836, it sought to be annexed into the United States. But Texas would not gain admission into the United States until 1845, at the very end of that year. And then it officially joins the United States. And when that happens, that is what really upset Mexico, because it was clear Texas was lost for good now that it had become part of the United States. But the issue over the boundary between the United States and Mexico was never really fully established during this period. So there was a boundary dispute that is immediate a cause of the war, and the territory in conflict was between the Rio Grande River, which you know where that is. That's the present boundary between Mexico and the United States today in South Texas. But from there northwards to the Nueces River, which is a few hundred miles north of the Rio Grande. That territory in between those two rivers, the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, was disputed territory. It wasn't clear who that territory belonged to in South Texas. Mexico, of course, claimed that the border was at the Nueces River, and the United States claimed that the border was at the Rio Grande. But it was disputed territory, and in 1845, President James K. Polk comes to power in the United States. And he believed in westward expansion. And he particularly was interested in taking California, because if the United States had access to California, the country would extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And this was very much in the strategic interest of the United States at this time. And Polk had actually campaigned on bringing California into the Union. And Texas joins as soon as his presidency begins. And Polk tried to buy Polk tried to buy California from Mexico. But, of course, the Mexicans refused. Santa Anna refused to sell California to the United States. And so Polk knows that he's going to need a war if he wants to take California. And the way Polk would go about doing this is that Polk, in 1846, he sent American troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. And the American troops went all the way down to the Rio Grande. And of course, when they got that far south, they were fired upon by Mexican troops. And this was what allowed Polk to go before Congress. And Polk in 1846 goes before Congress in Washington, and he says, quote, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil," end quote. And of course, that was a little bit of a fabrication because it was disputed territory where the Mexicans had shot on the Americans. But nonetheless, Polk needed some type of conflict to be able to start a war with Mexico, and he got it in the boundary dispute. And the war was actually quite controversial in the United States, but nonetheless, Congress lined up behind Polk, and the war machine started to be established and to go into high gear. And after the boundary dispute was basically when the Mexican-American War began in 1846. And the war was fought on three fronts, and you can kind of see that here in the red, where the movements of the American Army. First, the American Army would move through northern Mexico down to Monterrey. There was a big battle at Monterrey where the Americans were victorious. Then out through the western territories into California, where the American Army easily took control of California and places like New Mexico. And then also there was an amphibious assault through Veracruz during these years. And as I mentioned, most of the war was fought in 1847. And the war was a humiliating defeat for Mexico and a great victory for the United States. And Mexico lost pretty much every battle. And why Mexico lost the war is kind of a historical debate. And that's one of the main arguments of the book that we'll be reading this week. The author, Timothy Henderson, and we'll be discussing online, he argues that Mexico lost the war not only because it was divided and weak internally, but also because there was a lack of patriotism. There was a lack of a sense of nationhood in Mexico. So people just did not rally to defend the Mexican cause. And I think there's some truth to that, but there's a newer book out that came out recently that I read over the summer, and this new interpretation says that, no, really Mexico didn't lose because there was a lack of patriotism, but rather it had to do with Mexico's suffering economy, and Mexico did not have the economic might to be able to confront the United States. And for instance, in all these battles, the American troops were all well paid and well supplied, but that was not the case with the Mexican army. Many of the Mexican troops, they had been forced into the army. They didn't have professional training. They didn't have modern weaponry. And so there was a lack of morale, in other words, among the Mexican troops. And they weren't paid as well. They were always due back pay in the Mexican army. And another good example of the United States' superior economic ability was the artillery that was used in many of the battles. Mexico's artillery could not shoot as far as the artillery of the United States Army, and so it wasn't as powerful. And this really weakened the Mexican Army when it confronted the United States in open battle. And so the American Army was simply able to overwhelm the Mexican Army with its artillery power in many of these battles. And we can continue to discuss about this online. What was it? Why did Mexico lose? Was it the lack of patriotism and the lack of a sense of nationhood in Mexico, or was it simply the United States' superior economic abilities and its more modern and professional army? We'll go into some more detail about that in the online discussion this week. And about 20,000 Mexican soldiers were killed in the war, and for the United States, lost about 1,700 troops in the battles with Mexico. But the United States actually lost about 12,000 more troops due to diseases, and it was particularly while they were in Veracruz, which is a very tropical place where a lot of Americans succumbed to yellow fever and malaria. And the U.S. Army would go on to occupy Mexico City for about 9 months in 1848. The U.S. Army occupied Mexico City and hoisted the American flag up right there in the Central Plaza of Mexico City. And there was a debate as the U.S. Army occupied Mexico City about what exactly to do with Mexico, how much territory should be incorporated. And you can see here on the map that the territory that was handed over to the United States. And this is what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is. And I do want you to know quite a bit about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and you'll read about it towards the end of the book, A Glorious Defeat, next week, I believe. And Mexico and the treaty, number one, the treaty ends the war, and Mexico loses over half of its national territory, well over 500,000 square miles of land, to the United States. The U.S. paid about $15 million for the land that you see shaded in the tan color there. California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, Colorado, and of course much of West Texas. And, this was part of the reason why the war was a humiliating defeat for Mexico, because it loses over half of its national territory. And in the territory, there were about 100,000 Mexicans that lived in the territory that was handed over to the United States. And they were given the option. They could either move south and go live in Mexico, or they could remain, in the places where they had lived their entire lives. And if they chose to remain, and the vast majority of those 100,000 Mexicans chose to remain in the territory, they could become U.S. citizens with full rights, full civil rights that Americans enjoyed, and they could also retain their right to keep their religion and their traditions and their language. And as I said, the vast majority chose to stay where they had been born and raised in places such as California and Texas. And so the war ends in 1848, and the United States retreats and returns to the United States, returns northwards, and it brought an end to the war. And Mexico's political instability really continued after this period, because there was a lot of finger pointing about why the war had been lost. And today Santa Anna is not remembered as a very fond figure in Mexican history, and it has a lot to do with the Mexican-American War, because he was the one who oversaw the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the loss of half of Mexico's national territory. So we'll go into more detail about all of this in the online discussion these next 2 weeks, and I'll see you online.